Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy, and today is September 13th, 2021. This topic, dealing with resistance, is probably my favorite topic. It's the one I spend the most time thinking about with parents, thinking about with the clients that we have in the field, and thinking about at our intensives. And it's actually the one that I think about the most when teaching and training therapists because it's the thing that can derail therapy. I want to start off with a story that you may have heard me tell before, but I think leads really well into this idea about dealing with resistance with effectiveness. I was sitting at a conference a couple of years ago before the pandemic in Houston, Texas, in the fall of 2019, I believe. And I'd come there for a couple of activities, but one of them was to attend a talk that was given by Harriet Lerner, the author of The Dance of Anger, one of my favorite books on boundaries, and several other wonderful books. And she was asked to give a talk on shame during this conference. So she, as always, had a well thought out, well prepared talk that she gave on shame that lasted about an hour. And the MC or the host, in between each speaker, I think we had four speakers that day, in between each speaker would come up with a question or two from the audience and then to add one question that he had for the speaker. So after Harriet's talk on shame, he walked up to the podium and he said, his first question was from himself. He said, I'm wondering how you deal with shame in therapy. And Harriet thoughtfully paused for a moment and she said to him, I think you're just asking me how I do therapy. And I thought that was so wise and so deep because what distinguishes therapy from other means of communicating, other means of being with somebody is that fundamentally it's a different way of being. It's not just about dispensing information, but it's about creating a moment, an hour, a place for the client where they can feel safe to explore all of themselves. If anything we do pricks or triggers their shame, that is, I'm not good enough, I'm not going to be lovable, I'm not going to be acceptable, my therapist is going to get bored of me or frustrated or angry or disappointed or upset with me, we've essentially re-wounded them in the same ways that led them to the problems that they're seeing us for. So therapy is about treating resistance. That's really what we're treating. That's what distinguishes us from a teacher. A teacher just gives information. And the therapeutic process is creating a container where the client can come to their own awareness and their understanding. And that must occur in the context of a safe relationship. So that's the kind of the outset of this. I wanted to say something first before we get into it. It's very important that you hear this at the outset. That it's important that you take care of yourself. This particular broadcast and any application it has to parenting must be understood with the foundation that you're responsible, that it's okay, that it's imperative even that you take care of yourself. So when I talk about holding space or not reacting or being a container, and I'll talk about those as we go along. When I talk about being a safe person for somebody, if you are compromised, if you are extending yourself beyond your energy allows you to extend yourself, then you're going to leak onto the client or onto the child or onto the parent. So it has to be assumed first that you're capable of having boundaries and taking care of yourself. Then we can talk about the task of dealing with resistance with effectiveness. Let's talk about what resistance can look like. Resistance can simply be not understanding. I'll give you a very simple example. I have many clients who will ask the same question over and over again of why. Why did she do this to me? Why are they doing this? Parents can ask it about children. Children can ask it about parents. Parents can ask it about partners and so forth and so on. And the incredulous question of why really is a statement about I don't like it, I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm frustrated. It's more of an expression of some emotion. My therapist one time called this lack of understanding that fits under the umbrella of resistance. She called it pseudo stupidity. I think she was referring to me specifically about where we kind of feign not understanding, because if we understood, it would require us to look at ourselves in a much more honest way. We would have, first of all, to be able to see the similarities between us and the person about whom we're asking the question. So if I cannot understand you, if you're so strange, so foreign to me, that I perceive you as other, right? Not me. Something much more fundamentally different than me that I can comprehend. Then I can retain my own defenses and the denial and the lack of awareness. But to understand you, I have to in some way be able to relate to it. And I don't want to. That feels too threatening and too scary. So not understanding is a form of resistance. I think the most underestimated form of resistance is this next one, agreeing. In psychoanalytic theory, we call it introjection. Cooperating. Flight to health. Being good. Being a good client. One of the most important pieces of advice I ever received from a colleague, from a friend, was to stop trying to be a good client. My daughter shared with me that the pivotal moment in therapy, one of the pivotal moments in therapy as a client for her, is when she stopped trying to be a good client and an enlightened person in therapy and was just herself. She didn't even think that she could use therapy to vent about people, because she had to say something like, well, I really know what they're going through and I can understand and see how they're coming to this conclusion or to this behavior, and so I can't really be mad at them. And of course, therapy is a place ideally where you get to be yourself, which means sometimes you go to complain, sometimes you go to be unenlightened and just frustrated. Cooperation, being good, it's probably one of the most common concerns that parents have about sending a child to therapy at Evoke, is that the child can look good in some contexts, right? You worry that we're gonna be fooled, have the wool pulled over our eyes, and we won't see that down beneath the cooperative and good behavior is somebody who's compromised. Now, as I go along tonight and I talk about therapy a little bit longer, you'll understand why that form of resistance is not invisible to those who understand what therapy is. One other thing I want to say as I go from step to step here is that you can think about this, of course, in terms of your own resistance. You can think about this in terms of how your therapist responds to your resistance. Sometimes resistance looks like pleasing or a capacity to avoid consequences. A lot of parents wonder if kids are faking good because they're just trying to get out of trouble. I think, again, what parents underestimate is that, yes, we lie, we tell the therapist what we want to hear, we think they want to hear. We tell our parents what we think they want to hear. We tell our spouses what we think they want to hear to avoid consequences, right? To be able to control the outcomes, behaviors, perception, feelings of other people. But we also do it because of an intrinsic feeling of shame. So while a child might be avoiding consequences by not being themselves, not being their true or their real self, there also is always some kind of shame involved in that kind of response. I love what David Grand, I'll talk a little bit later tonight about therapy approaches that seek to fix clients and the danger there. But part of it is that I think that the technique, right? The theory tends to eclipse the client, and the therapist loses contact with the client. One of my favorite books, because of this experience that I have with other theories, from David Grand on brain spotting. I was reading a book, I was requested by one of our therapists to give a basic tutorial on brain spotting to our therapist, and I'm not formally trained in it, so I read the book by Dr. David Grand. And what I love about what he says in there, as much as I've ever seen any theory talk about this, he says, above all, or aside from it all, If the therapist doesn't take into account the client's impulse or instinct to please the therapist, then therapy will not progress to an effective outcome. You have to watch for and see and listen to a client's instinct to please you or to please the parents. The very fact that clients are trying to sell me. I had a client that had nothing to do. This was an intensive program where I was talking to a father recently, and I could feel on his inquiry call where he was trying to convince me that he had done everything right. And I said, it feels like from the get-go that you're kind of in a defensive posture. I said it very gently, that you want to, that somebody has been accusing you of not trying, of codependency, of dropping the ball, whatever it is. And he almost got emotional. He paused and a big sigh. He gave me a big sign. He said, absolutely. I feel like I'm getting attacked from all sides, from my co-parent, from my therapist at home, from my consultant. We have to be aware of the fundamental relationship dynamics between therapist and client. And it is so easy to re-abuse a client if we need them to make progress so that we feel good and effective. Same with a parent, right? The minute that a child has to get better so I feel better, I'm simply re-abusing them. Fighting non-compliance and power struggling, kind of that oppositional presentation, that's a more common. That's what I think people think of when they think of resistance. That's actually pretty easy to deal with, unless it escalates to violent levels. It's pretty easy to deal with resistance. That is straight in the front door, hand in your face, push you away, reject what you have to say. You can kind of see the struggle in the individual more clearly, more easily. Rationalizing, justifying, or intellectualizing. For those of you that are listening to this or watching this live, I'm going to say something. I teach what I'm about to teach you every day to somebody, to a therapist at Evoke, to other therapists, to therapists that I train aside from Evoke. I teach this constantly, this next point. And so often people will agree with me. It makes sense once you explain it. But then they're incapable or unable to perform the skill that they just agreed to in the next moment, with the next case, in the next example. And the point that I want to talk about is rationalizing, justifying, intellectualizing. Those are kind of intellectual ways of kind of defending oneself against the threat. And so what I teach therapists is it's not really a great skill to point out to somebody that they're rationalizing or justifying. Most people can do that without even any training. The real skill, the expertise of the therapist is to be present with the client in such a way that they don't feel threatened, that they don't have the need to justify. See, justification, all of these defenses are a wall or a defense against a threat, the threat of judgment or abandonment, typically. And if we don't understand that and don't learn how to show up in a different way than people have in their past, then we're going to do the same thing to them. So I teach the field staff out of Evoke and anywhere that I train. It's not about confronting justification. It's showing up in a way that over time, the client doesn't need to justify themselves to you anymore because you're safe, because you're not a threat. So you can start to see, if you're a parent or even a partner, you can start to see how you become partially responsible for the defense. Or you can be. You can be contributing to the defense. So the very thing that you're complaining about with your partner or with your child or with whomever is something that you're contributing to. Are you an unsafe person? Is your fear, your anxiety, your anger, your frustration, your disappointment seen or interpreted or felt by the other person as a threat? And do they need to put up this idea of themselves that you'll find more acceptable? Forgetting, not remembering, it's kind of a natural, honest defense. There's sometimes when I have clients over a period of many years and we'll have talked about an issue some years ago. I mean, sometimes we forget just to forget. I should say that. But sometimes we've talked about something really, really profound and central to their issues. And then we talk about it months or years later, even. And they'll say, oh my gosh, I remember talking about this. I remember getting it at one point, even experiencing it as an epiphany at one point, but forgetting it since. It's really hard, folks. One of my therapists said this weekend, the happiest things that I could hear from a therapist at Evoke. She said when processing some work that we had done together, she said, we were asking her about her experiences with other programs, and her response was, I realize at Evoke, I have to unlearn so many things that I've learned. And I couldn't have been happier. It's the same feeling I have when parents say, this process really is about unlearning things. Most of what I teach, I think what makes this podcast interesting is all of the unlearning that we do together. There's so many things, there's so many ways that we were trained, that we were taught about the way things are or should be that simply are not true. Avoiding, not talking, missing appointments, not doing assignments. Those are forms of resistance. I used to love it. My observation was, we typically will send home most assignments that the young people in our program do to their parents during the course of their treatment. And one of the letters that gets forgotten, and I'm putting that in air quotes, that gets forgotten to turn in, is the war story, or the impact letter that children write to parents, telling the parents why they're angry and hurt, why the child is angry and hurt. The assignments that say I'm going to do better and I'm fixed and I figured it out, those letters never get forgotten. But the one that get forgotten are the ones that are going to be triggering to parents. If I write home and send you a letter about how smoking pot and drinking and partying with friends was wonderful and I never felt better, that's the war story assignment. If I send that home to you, mom and dad, I'm afraid it's going to freak you out. So I'll just forget to give it to Brad this week, to stick it in the mail envelope before the therapist leaves. And then next week I'll have forgotten it. It wasn't avoidance. Sabotaging. I was sitting with my close circle this weekend. Us four therapists were talking and chatting, and I was talking about the self-sabotage broadcast, and I was explaining that in many ways self-sabotaging is a kind of preemptive failure, right? I'm going to sink my own ship so I can take control back, so that somebody else won't beat me to the punch and sink me first or point it out first. So sabotaging lowers the emotional intensity because I'm lowering everybody's expectations by my self-sabotage, my failure, my lack of progress. Denial. Everybody has denial. We all have a lot of it, all of us. It's universal and inescapable. The only problem really is, and this goes for parents as much as anybody, is to fantasize that you don't have a lot of denial. That's the only problem. And so again, we don't punch the defense in the face. We understand it. We replace it with compassionate curiosity. A lot of these aren't necessarily conscious. So when we talk about overt, conscious refusal or resistance, right? Or even when we'll describe a part of the responsibility of a wilderness therapist is to adequately, intelligently explain the child to the parent. And I think sometimes when we're explaining why they're doing what they're doing and what their needs are that they're getting met out of this, I think it can be understood or even suggested at times that it sounds like it's all a conscious process, and it's not. Thinking that things don't apply to you. Again, from when I'm talking to you on these broadcasts, on these videos, or on these podcasts, I am saying to you so much of the same things I say to your children. In a sense that I'm saying, work on yourself. Let's just assume if I'm talking to the child, your parents aren't going to change. They're going to still have the same neuroses, the same blind spots, the same biases. Now, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to heal? How are you going to grow? How are you going to get along with them without compromising core aspects of yourself? So the idea that it doesn't apply to me is kind of a universal. I've described that a defense, right? Resistance, defense is kind of like a wall that you build around yourself to protect yourself from threats or perceived or real threats. And then if somebody comes into that space where you've built this wall and you see in their hand a jackhammer or an axe, a pick, and a hammer, you immediately, even though they tell you it's for your own good, you immediately build the defense thicker and stronger and higher. You reinforce it. So when we engage defenses in an aggressive way, we contribute to their reinforcement. When we meet them with curiosity and compassion, as scary and as crazy and as nonsensical as they can seem, when we meet them with curious compassion or compassionate curiosity, they tend over time to go away. You can have your boundaries, but taking the judgment out of it. We teach the staff all the time. You can have boundaries, you can have consequences, but take the shame and the judgment out of it. I still work on this. I still struggle with this. And even in the last 2 weeks, my wife has given me feedback about some of the things I say in my tone of voice and how it can be shaming and judgmental. The shift in psychotherapy moves from ideal, thinking of things as ideals to thinking of things as practical. I used to say to the students, if smoking crack worked and brought you greater meaning and connection and serenity and health over time, if it did that, we would teach you how to do it. So it's a very practical, psychotherapy is a very practical, non-judgmental approach, ideally. We'll get there. We'll get to where you want to go, but not necessarily using the route of the vehicle that you imagine. I can't say what I'm about to say too emphatically. I cannot say it. Probably the most core idea that I could challenge in most clients is the idea that change won't come through a butt kicking or through anger or rage at the defense or the behavior or through judgment or shame. Change, long-term, effective long-term change will only happen in the context of compassion. At some point, no matter how horrendous your behavior is, it's got to be met with compassion and grace for it to heal. Because all that symptom is the tip of the proverbial iceberg, and underneath is the wound or the trauma, and they're connected to each other. So it's not even hate the sin and love the sinner. It's have compassion for the sin and the sinner. Understand the sin and the sinner. Be curious. Listen to what it's trying to tell you. I think of Evoke in our program as a Trojan horse kind of approach. We accept the premise that your children are struggling. They're obviously struggling. And we will keep them safe, and we will give them tools and skills and experiences to try to encourage growth and healing. That's We accept that idea and premise. And that's the gift that we give to you by enrolling your child in the program. But like the story of the Trojan horse, once we've got past the gate, instead of the army getting out of the horse, the therapists and the coaches and the podcasts and the books and the letters and the parent portal and the parent support groups and the intensives, all of that becomes part of the process. So while at the beginning, at the outset, it might not have seemed like it was necessary, that's really what the healingist process is about. And like I've said in the last couple of broadcasts, I think the most desirable outcome in therapy at Evoke, at our intensives, or in our wilderness program is a positive enough experience for both parent and client and young person, if it's a wilderness client, that they see therapy as something that can benefit their life. I think we can give people some pretty remarkable experiences in the short term. I really do. I see them all the time. But more than that, the work is never done. Right? We're always learning and growing. I was just saying to my therapist just last week, she's in her late 80s, and she's by far the smartest person I've ever met in these areas that we talk about. And she is just as much a student today as she has been her entire life. She's a voracious reader. She goes to conferences. She listens to lectures. I mean, this woman has written books, 22 books. Some of them are 500 pages, a book of the most intricate, beautiful therapeutic instruction that I've ever read in my life. And she is the most humble, hungry student I've ever met. We never stop learning, ideally, until we're done. Finding ways to show up vulnerably yourself. I think in families and as parents, we think we have to be right. We think we have to have the answers and have it figured out, right? Somewhere we learned that. Somewhere we learned it wasn't safe. And we created an environment in our family where that was true again. But as some of you know, your greatest contributions to your child's growth is when you have been willing to show up vulnerably. It's like when students in the field say to me, the group doesn't feel safe. And sometimes I empathize, but I might encourage them or invite them to consider trying to share their vulnerability in the group. The way to make it safe, I explain, is for you to be vulnerable first. You don't have to do that. I'm not going to force you into an unsafe situation. But so often, when one person takes the first step, all of the walls come down just a little bit. So instead of coming out your child's defenses or symptoms, drugs, alcohol, cutting, suicidality, depression, anxiety, school refusal, eating issues, body image issues, whatever it is, oppositionality, whatever it is, instead of coming at it with a pickaxe and a hammer, take off your armor. Set down your weapons of defense destruction. Don't rip the clutch, don't rip the crutch away from them without recognizing the cost. The best way to encourage people to lower their defenses is to lower yours. Somebody taught me once that the biggest mistake that therapists make in the therapeutic relationship is too much distance, right? They become these dispensaries of information and theory and skills. Shame and defenses are interrelated, right? If there was no shame, if we were okay not knowing, being imperfect, being fallible, making mistakes, everything else would just be easy. Wouldn't even be therapy. We would just learn new things and acknowledge our mistakes and our lack of awareness and then do them. It's really important that you learn to not win and not create a culture I was asked by my daughter. I did an interview a year or two ago on the podcast. I didn't think I needed to do one, but somebody had asked for it, so we decided we would try it. Where I got interviewed by a former client and by my daughter. And one of the questions my daughter asked me that I wasn't part of the prep, she said, "What is the issue that you talk about and teach the most that you still work on, that you still struggle with?" And I said, "It's this one. It's being right. I have created it in my family at times. That's my trauma that I've inflicted on my children is that I have to be right, and that it takes vulnerability and courage for me to be wrong, to make mistakes, to say I'm sorry. It takes some work. It takes some ego deflation for me to show up human." We try to prove it to them. We try to not just be right, but Dr. Reedy says and Dr. So and so says, and this is what the book says, and this is what everybody thinks. So we shift from confronting the defense to honoring the defense. Like I mentioned earlier, all we're treating is resistance, understanding the behaviors instead of trying to change them. This is the magic right here. Is if when you understand the defense, when you understand the crazy behavior, the behavioral problem, you reduce it, you contribute to its reduction. Try to replace some of your triggered behaviors and triggered responses emotionally with curiosity. And really, it's about humility, isn't it? It's about watching somebody do something. Just the other night, I was talking to my wife. My wife would tell you that she has anxiety. And just the other night, as we were just getting ready to fall asleep, and sometimes her anxiety kind of peaks right before we fall asleep. So we kind of have this joke that we could talk about all the things that could go wrong right before we go to sleep. I told her it adds to the vividness of my dreams when she does that. I said to her with compassion, I said, "Why does it help you to worry about things?" And I didn't mean it as a challenge or confrontation. I just said, what does it do? And she said with tears in her eyes, she said, "It helps me feel safe." But what got her really emotional is she said, "You've never asked me that." This was a week ago. She said, "I don't know that we've ever thought about my worrying with this kind of compassion." As she was saying this, she was flooded with tears. And I said to her, I said, "I think that's partially my fault, and maybe we could spend more time being compassionate toward your symptoms. I know we've been compassionate towards mine." Remaining curious, asking questions. By the way, I said to her when she told me that worrying helps her to feel safe, I said to her, that sounds like a very good reason to obsess and worry about things, which I was, again, merely stating the truth about how I felt and how I saw it. We remain curious. Hold on to behavior change lightly. Behavior is just a manifestation of the inner world. So remain curious about it. Maybe they're trying to please us. The highs in this process aren't that high. The lows aren't that low. Take a step back, kind of a we'll see attitude. Some of you read this story. It goes around. I think the author's anonymous, about the village in China where a family got a horse, and there's a long story, but the lesson is in each version of the story. First, they got the horse, and everybody thought they were going to be, this was great fortune, and the father said, "Well, I don't know. Could be good, could be bad, too early to tell." And then the horse trampled his son when he was training it. And the whole village said, "Oh, this is a horrible catastrophe." And he said, "Could be bad, could be good, too early to tell." And then along came the army, and they drafted all the young men, but his son, who had been injured by the horse, couldn't be drafted. And later on, they found that entire army had died in battle. We don't know. We remain curious. And we learn, evoke, it's not evoke, but at evoke, we embrace the idea that We learn to feel everything. We learn to integrate everything. Even with my clients, when they relapse, when they regress, they get so angry with themselves. And I know what that feels like because I do the same thing. And I'll offer to them, I'll say, we can beat you up or hang you or punish you with public humiliation and flogging if you would like. Or we can have compassion and try to understand. When parents come to me and say, when parents feel very guilty after listening to something I've spoke on or something, one of these podcasts or a parent workshop or a parent assignment, and they come away feeling a tremendous amount of guilt and shame and say, I've ruined my child. I mean, my response is, okay, you've dented your child. Now, what should we do with you? Should we give you the death penalty? Should we lock you up for life? What should we do for you? Because I don't see any good coming out of those things. Maybe we can look at your mistakes or missteps with compassion and understanding, trace them back to your childhood trauma that's not been resolved, heal that to some degree, and then you're capable of showing up differently to your child. Doesn't that seem like a more, pragmatically speaking, a more valuable way for us to spend our time? But we don't know how to stop hating ourselves. We don't know how to stop hating the sin. We think that's the only way to keep it under control. So we learn to honor all of it. We learn to honor the feelings, the entire experiences, the things that people think are negative. We get curious about where they're coming from and where they're leading. Yes, I wrote, they may be saying something crazy or acting crazy, but telling them that won't help. I talked about last two broadcasts about the idea of children need their dignity. So do parents. One of my most frustrating things as a professional is watching you guys as parents get beat up because of your trauma and the symptoms that it presents. I just find that unacceptable. Of course, I have to show the same compassion to the therapists that are teaching that, right? Or I'll just be continuing the process. Can you identify with the defense? Can you relate to it? Sometimes when a child in our program expresses something in a group setting that might be a little bit upsetting or disturbing, I'll ask people to relate to part of it. Can you relate to the feeling, the instinct? He said he wanted to kill his stepfather. Have any of you ever felt like you wanted to kill somebody, you were so mad? And people have a hard time saying yes. They're afraid if they say yes, I can relate, that they're condoning the behavior, that they're saying it's okay, that it will run out of control. That once you let that horse out of the barn, so to speak, that it's going to become wild. But how do you catch a horse? You ride alongside of it. You don't stand in front of it, but you guide it by riding alongside of it. At least not being a cowboy or a rancher. That's my understanding about the way of retrieving horses works. Stay in not knowing. When I teach therapists, I tell them, there's a great gift in not having answers. And it's hard because you think you're supposed to have all the answers, but the kinds of questions and dilemmas that people are bringing to you are in some ways unanswerable. The main idea here is that at Evoke, we believe, I believe, I teach, we teach that the goal is to find the client, not to fix them. But finding them fixes them. Understand the child. Understand the anxious mother or the anxious father, the angry father or the angry mother. Understand them first. Follow, as I say, the trail of crumbs that their behavior or their symptoms presents back home to the original trauma or wound or message or idea. I think most parents think that this process is about, parents will tell me, I just want to get back to where my son or my daughter will listen to me. but it's mostly about listening. The shift that I hope you all make at Evoke and through these podcasts is not that you become more clever, that you have more analogies and metaphors and stories in your arsenal or your repertoire. That'll happen. But that you realize that the healing balm is to listen. If you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say? Ideally, you would go back and listen and see them. Are you seeing how our instinct, what we've been taught are the solution to the problem, are actually part of the cause? We take the poison thinking it's the cure. Lecturing, teaching, preaching, advice giving are all likely to provoke defenses. Confronting, challenging. You can do some of that when the relationship is established and safe. There are things that I can say to clients, adults and young people, where I get away with it because they know that I love them. They know that there's no judgment there. And then there's times when I stumble over myself and say something that I don't even anticipate is going to be a problem, but they feel judged by it. Then I have to back up and apologize. I love this comment. I'll go back to our list in just a second. This comment that says, parenthood is above all a relationship. It's not a skill to be acquired. Attachment is not a behavior to be learned, but a connection to be sought. Another way of talking about this, looking at this quote right here, I love this quote from Carl Jung. He said, the real and effective treatment of neuroses is always individual. And for this reason, the stubborn application of a particular theory or method must be characterized as basically wrong. In other words, if your model for fixing your child, if it eclipses your ability to see them, it's wrong. You're part of the problem. They don't need more information. By the time we get students at their teen years, it's about 10% information and 90% a healing process. We know this because they lecture to each other. 2 weeks into the program, kids become experts on everything psychological to the new guys. I used to use this example where I would take that pound of M&Ms, the big bag of M&Ms, and I would say to kids who were demonstrating a lack of understanding, like, why can't I call home, or why can't I go home after Evoke? And I will say, if you can write a one-page paper on why you, the parent, and me, the therapist, might not want the child to go home or to call the girlfriend or whatever it is, I'll give you this bag of M&Ms before I'm finished with it. Because a bag of M&Ms in a Willis program is worth about $10,000 of our currency. Like, that's how unique and powerful that reinforcer is. By the time I'm finishing what I'm asking for, the child is writing down a well-articulated list of reasons. They're not missing information. It's in there. They know it for other people. They know how to tell the other kids how to be and what to do. But that's not what their mental health issues are about. A small percentage, but the grand majority is about healing. So why doesn't mean why. Why means I don't like it. I don't want it. I don't agree with it. I've said this to you before. It goes for parents and children. When parents say to me, why does my child do this? It's a fair question. Asking it twice? Okay, asking it 3 times? And then I'm wondering if you're committed to not knowing, because that's your job, to understand. To start to build a conceptual framework where you understand their behavior. And that's why listening, and specifically reflective listening, can help, right? We become better listeners. When I wrote The Journey of the Heroic Parent, my goal was primarily, the message was, if I can help parents see and understand their children in a different way, in a different framework, everything else will work from there. So the goal is to give parents new eyes and ears, to give your children new eyes and ears. to give our therapist new eyes and ears, and learn to share from the I perspective. I feel, I think, I want, I believe, in my experience. This is part of the 8 tools that I wrote about and that I've spoken about many times. Why don't we do what I'm talking about? We're afraid and we want to control things, period. I mean, that fear, anger, and control, that's Star Wars. That's what George Lucas was trying to teach us in Star Wars. I mean, my favorite quote from Yoda is that fear leads to anger and anger leads to the dark side. I mean, that we're afraid if we just understand, it'll be out of control. We do it because we're embarrassed and we're ashamed. I tell parents all the time, if you parent at a higher level, most people will think you're doing it wrong. So you have to be willing to confront your own childhood messages, your own programming. Be careful of things that stop things like black and white, all or nothing. You never do this, you always do this. Catastrophizing and generalizing. All of those things that shut down curiosity and dialogue and understanding. These are really just a lot about the 8 tips. Watch out for imperatives. That's why at our program we ask you not to use should, shouldn't, must, mustn't, ought, ought not, good, bad, right, wrong, evil. All of those shut down communication. There's a lot of things I don't do really well. One of the things I do well consistently is I don't use those words. When I hear them either come out of my mouth or come out of a therapist's or a parent's or my wife's mouth or my children's mouth, it stands out to me. It's a stark contrast to the sensibility that I'm trying to adopt. Moralizing over things, using absolutes, all of these things tend to shut down communication and curiosity. Or over-identifying, trying to fix our childhood and our parents, trying to give them what we needed and didn't get. I love this quote by Dr. Gill, my therapist, J.D. Gill, from her book, The Forms of Life, or just Forms of Life. She writes, the experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was, quote, very bad at home is now, quote, nothing, unquote. This difference in experience allows for the realization things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. One of the reasons why I am more effective than you with your children, or you can be more effective with my children than I can at times, is because of this ability to not judge it, to not be terrified by it, to not be overwhelmed, to not be triggered by it. My position allows me to do that. But having said that, it's not a given. It takes work. It takes practice. It takes discipline. It takes understanding. Tonight's broadcast is about learning what it means to be with someone in such a way that we don't provoke the defense. And at Evoke, in the Wilderness program, that looks like us explaining your child and all of their behavior in a way that makes sense. Or if you're coming to an intensive, it means understanding how the dilemmas in your current day life can be traced back to training and programming and experiences and wounds that you had in childhood. I'm going to read the quote one more time straight through because I think it's important for those listening. This is from J.D. Gill, Forms of Life. The experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was very bad at home is now nothing. The difference in experience allows for the realization things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. When the bishop gives Jean Valjean the candlesticks, he shifts everything for Jean Valjean. I'm referring to Les Mis, of course. That's the moment when Jean Valjean expected what had been happening to him his whole life, which was he was punished for bad behaviors. For some reason, the bishop saw past all of that and gave the man who had attacked him and stolen from him an extra candlestick and said, "You were silly, you left the most expensive parts." Now, for those of you that might get panicked at what I'm saying, I go back to slide number 2 of the evening. You have to take care of yourself. In this story of Les Miserables, the bishop could do it because he could do it. If you can't do it, it doesn't work. I love this speaking about resistance. From Addictive Thinking by Abraham Tversky. He writes, the mother of a young man who was destroying himself with alcohol and other drugs could not understand how he could be so oblivious to the disastrous effects that chemicals were having on his life. She asked for help in dealing with him. She said, "But don't tell me I have to put him out of the house or that I should not bail him out of jail," she said. "I don't want to hear that." Abraham Tversky responded, "Please tell me how much is 2 + 2, but don't say 4. She had been unable to see that her own thinking was no less distorted than her son's. If there's a take home for tonight, I don't know who you are, who's watching, who's listening. It is to understand what your project is and to make that your life's work. By project, I mean what are your mental health issues? What's your neuroses? What is your programming? What wounds are you carrying around that are being expressed symptomatically? What's the barrier in you that prevents you from seeing your child and understanding and showing patience? What's the barrier that's preventing you from practicing healthy self-care so that you're not relying on your family, your parents, your children, your spouse to take care of you? You're expecting everybody else to do it. Where did you learn that? Do your work. That's the answer. That's my answer. That's the opposite of resistance. So take homes for this evening. If you want some education on communication skills, communication skills are not in and of themselves the difference, but they demonstrate a new way of being in a relationship with somebody. The 8 Tools is a great source for that. The chapter in my book on the 8 Tools, or the podcast or the broadcast, video broadcast. If you want research that shows what I'm talking about tonight, motivational interviewing. And I did a broadcast called Motivational Interviewing and Informed Parenting. You know, these are thousands of research studies that show that confronting defenses is less effective than honoring them and understanding them and showing compassionate curiosity toward them. Let the child think, feel, and believe what they want. Your boundaries ought not to ideally. We provoke the defense when we want them to feel and think what we feel and think. And remember that above all, attachment is the most important thing. The relationship between you and them is the most important thing. And learning to respond to them in healthy, safe ways. It's important that you pull apart your emotional response and triggers from your boundaries. Boundaries are about taking care of what feels right to you, for you, in your life, in your family, in your relationships. And remember, at the end of the day, many, many issues, you cannot win. You can only choose how to lose. When you have a dilemma and it seems like you want to do a pro and con list and come up with the best solution that'll steer you clear of pain and difficulty, I would encourage you to consider the idea that you cannot win. You can only choose how to lose. Take care of yourself so that you can respond with compassion rather than fear or anger, so your child doesn't have to take care of you. I would say most parents that I ever meet do not relate to the idea that we talk about and teach constantly in our program, that parents want children to take care of them. It doesn't make sense to them because it doesn't feel like that. But the way that it looks is this: I can't sleep, I can't have serenity and peace unless you're safe and well. And while that might seem really, really close to loving a child, The child experiences that as pressure to take care of you. So that's why we have support groups for you at Evoke. That's why we ask you to go to Al-Anon and Families Anonymous. Go to places where there are other parents whose loved ones, or not just parents, but loved ones, go to places where other people who have loved ones destroying their lives, and find out how they cope. Find out how they manage their serenity. Find out how they take care of themselves and set boundaries. Find out how they love somebody who's hurting themselves. And then be with them on the journey. I mean, if you're here, if you're listening to this, if you're watching me live, I assume you're on the journey. You're willing to do this work. I'll answer one question at the end if there is one. Okay? But for now, I'm going to go through the upcoming events and announcements. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. We have support groups each week. Our next support group is September 16th, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, this Thursday, for any current or former alumni parents of our wilderness program. Also, we're doing one alumni-only meeting per month, and the next one is September 28th at 6:30 p.m. And then if you're an intensive alumni, that's tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, if you want to see about your resistance and learn about your own childhood and how it's impacting you today, come to an intensive. Finding You is our individual one. We have groups of 6 and 7 participants. We also do it online. There's still one space left in our September online. I think October, Finding You may be full up, but we might open up a second one if there's enough of a need. September 23rd, I think there might be one space left in that. Our Returning to You is full. We will open up another one shortly. Just email intensives@evoketherapy.com. These are all fantastic ways. Online is a great option if your time and resources are limited. If you want attachment-based coaching for parents or individuals, contact Travis at evoketherapy.com to find an Evoke-trained attachment-based therapist. We have pursuits, adventure trips all over the world, 3 to 30-day programs for families and young adults. Think sober fun, therapy light, or in between, or reconnecting to your work. We ask all current parents to attend, at some point, 6 12-step groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org for free classes or support groups in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on any podcast app. Just search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast. Use your favorite podcast platform or go to soundcloud.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy. Or on Instagram, you can also find us using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then we have a blog that has new content each week, wonderfully curated by Malia, who's also our moderator for this evening. She does a great job of recruiting and writing. She wrote a great blog last week, a very personal blog last week about the anniversary of September 11th that was personal to her, that I would recommend to you. All right, folks, I'm going to be doing two webinars broadcast this week. So the next one will be tomorrow night, September 14th at 6:30 p.m. It'll be a Q&A. Any questions left over from tonight or any new ones or topics, I'm happy to address those. You can always send those in between at webinar@evoketherapy.com. All right, I'll take one question before I wrap up this evening. Somebody writes, I recently was with my son who has been in and out of treatment over the last 4 years. He said in conversation that he has never liked women therapists, because growing up he had a woman therapist who liked to lecture a lot, pointing at me. I'm so glad we have done this work. I think before I would have defended myself and given another lecture. I was able to laugh and agree with him, saying, you're right, I used to think my job was to give advice. I now know that I was wrong. I am so grateful to have this new understanding. That was my comment. My question is, my 22-year-old son is resistant mostly because by agreeing, cooperating, or pleasing, which turns out to be avoiding and missing appointments, the therapeutic relationship eventually ends, as it has numerous times. Is he resistant because he hasn't found the right therapist? Is there any benefit in encouraging him to stick with it? What I'd really like to do is connect him with an Evoke coach. Is this getting into a circle? I think we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful because the act of trying to get somebody into therapy in and of itself is somewhat humiliating. I think offering it, I think asking questions about what he doesn't like, but if he feels your agenda, he's likely to push again. Your want for him to get better through this means is kind of confronting the defense. So I don't know the answer. I don't know what will be the magic pixie dust that'll open him up. I suspect it's about not having the right therapist. I always suspect that because a good therapist, wow, why wouldn't you go to a good therapist? Somebody who sees you, who cares about you, who's compassionate, who looks at all the things that you think are ugly about yourself with understanding and insight. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Um, so I think there's dialogues that you could have. You might surrender your agenda of trying to get him into therapy and tell him that, and just ask them if, with that surrendered, could he have a conversation? Offering him an Evoke coach, offering him my 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 uh, my broadcast on resistance or on what to look for in a therapist, or even the chapter in my book on what to look for in a therapist. There are things that you can do that can help him see and assess whether or not it's just been the wrong therapist. But pushing somebody into therapy, not a program like ours, but pushing somebody to outpatient therapy is a slippery slope because it can feel like a shaming message. So I would try to find some way to take the overt agenda, the overt pressure off of him. And I would try to see if outside of that agenda, outside of that pressure, if we could have a dialogue so that we can understand how to respond, so we can empathize, so we can relate to him. Again, a simple testimony of I've had similar experiences in therapy, and here's what I found through attachment-based work like the podcast or attachment-based work like your therapist is doing. Attachment-based because the therapist understands that the relationship between the therapist and the client is a microcosm, is a reparenting experience, and people that look through the lens of attachment understand what a secure attachment is versus an anxious, disorganized attachment is, or other kinds of attachment. So I hope that helps. It's a tough one. All right, folks. Thank you for joining me this evening. I will talk to you tomorrow night. If you're interested in attending, it'll be tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. It's just a live Q&A. Send in any questions before that. Thanks for joining me. For and on behalf of the people that love you, thanks for being willing to do your work. Take care. Have a great evening. See you in about 24 hours. Bye-bye.